first creative space where I'm having someone who is not Caribbean, but I think you'll see that we have a connection in spite of that. Preeta Samarasan is a Malaysian author. Evening is the Whole Day is her first book, and she has a new book that recently landed us last year, I believe. Preeta, can you tell the people what our connection is?
Okay, so we were roommates in 2008 at Breadloaf in Vermont, which is a writer's, what do you call it? Like it's a writer's retreat, I suppose, or a writer's workshop kind of thing.
And so you put an Antiguan and a Malaysian in a room together. I don't know about you, but I didn't know anything about Malaysia. Did you know anything about Antigua?
Very little, very little. I had read some Caribbean writers. I've always loved Caribbean literature. So I was quite excited to be put in a room with a Caribbean writer, but I didn't know anything about Antigua specifically. It's so small. I had not read, I mean, I knew Jamaica Kincaid. That's about it, really. But I was so excited to discover how much our cultures had in common, I suppose. In some, there were the differences, but also so many similarities. And we definitely shared a sense of humor, I think, which came across very quickly. Like we were laughing about the same things and found the same things ridiculous. And yeah.
I mean, of course, the irony was that some of the things we have in common is, I think, because of something we would both disavow, which is colonialism.
Yeah, British colonialism and kind of our responses to it, our reactions to it, or the way that it seeps into the culture, the way in a way we absorb it and make something of it. And I think what writers and artists make of it is what we have in common, maybe.
I found I was actually looking for my review of I'm going to see if I can share screen. Sure. I was actually looking for my review of can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can totally see it.
So my review of Evening is the Whole Day. I'm going to read part of it. So this book was written by my Breadloaf 2008 roommate, Preeta Samarasan. I'm glad I discovered it and her, and discovered too that though from different parts of the world, there was a lot that connected us, in part due to common cultural elements born, ironically enough, of our shared British colonial experience, or the residue thereof. As a Caribbean reader, certain things will feel startlingly familiar when you read this, and the parts unknown, well, that's part of the discovery, isn't it? I'm going to jump forward a bit. Speaking of style, I was immediately caught by the atmospheric punch, the there-ness of the place, and by how the author captures the speech patterns of the Malaysian people in a way that makes it both relatable to the non-Malaysian reader and authentic, or at least authentic sounding, since I'm not qualified to speak to its actual authenticity. It's certainly one of the challenges I grapple with as a Caribbean writer, and I think this Malaysian writer does a good job of it here. So I'm talking there about place and also about how you present the people, which I think is an intersection an unexpected intersection that we found. Perhaps it's true of any culture that was that found its own space its own self being pushed out to pour something else into it, and insisting that no, I am this thing beyond what you want to make me. Can you speak to that and how you respond to that review? I don't know if you've seen it before.
Yes, I have seen your review before. And I think, as you say, it would be difficult for you to speak about authenticity, but I think this is something that we both try to do, is to kind of reclaim a literary space that's uniquely, whether it's voice, style, themes, but I think especially voice and style. It's something that, it's interesting. I don't know if this is answering your question at all, but it's interesting. We connected in 2008 at a time when I had really I'd only been away from the US for 2 years. I had just left the US. And I think I was still very much at the beginning of this process of
Sikapin, you did your MFA in the US, yes?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And I finished in 2006 and left that same year. And I moved to France, where, of course, it's still a Western country. But the interesting thing for me about living here is that since I write in English, I'm really not a part of the literary scene here in that way. Like I live quite in terms of, my connections with other writers. I live quite an isolated life. Like I kind of do my own thing in my own little bubble, which was not entirely planned, but it was somewhere in my head when I left the US that I kind of needed to do this, to kind of carve out a space that was not, because I felt differently colonized, actually, still in America. I felt that America has this kind of voraciousness, especially having been in an MFA program. I felt like it was so easy to just give in to that and to be shaped by that, and you don't even realize it happening. You find your language and your thinking patterns kind of shaped by your environment. So and when we met, I was really at the beginning of that, oh, I'm just going to try to find some distance to carve that space for myself, to figure out who I am as a writer, you know, and what it means even for me personally to be a Malaysian writer. Like, what kind of voice, how do I do that? And I've noticed, because, you know, in the time since Breadloaf, you and I have mainly kept in touch or followed each other on social media, right? That's the main way that we have kind of followed each other's work and thoughts and views. And I noticed that you do the same thing too, you know, in exactly the same way that you speak to your audience that you have carved out, which is a Caribbean audience, an Antiguan audience, and you don't explain, you don't do a lot of like hand holding or guiding. And I don't know if you are aware of who your whole audience is, who your readers are, how many are Caribbean and how many are not, but you really have a kind of nonchalance, like you don't really, I mean, in a good way, you don't care, you're not
Well,
trying to.
I'll tell you one thing. My least favorite review that I've seen of anything I've written was a suggestion. I think the person was trying to be kind, because part of what something you said that just resonated was living in the Caribbean. I never lived in the US per se, but I lived in the Caribbean. We have a saying that when the US sneezes, we catch cold. We're that close in terms of their cultural impact on us. So we went from the British to the American, and it's almost a militant act to hold on to yourself in the space of all of these things coming at you. I think it helps me that I'm very much grounded in the Caribbean, and when I'm speaking, I'm not centering. I'm consciously or unconsciously. I'm not sure which all the time, but sometimes I think I'm consciously doing it. Sometimes it's just how I speak. I'm centering us, me, us, my people. And this is why I always refer to myself as a gal from Antigua. It reminds me, this is where you come from, and these are who. Not in a didactic sense, but this is the center of your voice. And even the Wadadli Pen program that I run, which is to nurture and showcase literary arts in Antigua, I'm always trying to remind the writers that are coming through that program that your story starts with you, because we're taught that story is something that happens to other people. I remember you saying that when you discovered Naipaul and Rushdie and so on, you started realizing that stories don't just happen to white people in Britain. And so that is almost like a reclamative act that we consciously have to do it. And I think in the social media space, I do it as well. So to the point I was making initially, when a Caribbean person says, this feels like us, this feels authentic, that feels good to me. If they laugh at the things that we find funny, that feels good to me. And when someone said, going back to Lee's favorite review, that in the writing of it, they can see me trying to my consciousness of the gaze of the Western audience, that kind of pissed me off, because the reason why I write, for instance, our dialect the way I do is because I don't have, it's an oral tradition. So I'm writing it how I hear it. And my base is, I was taught, my whole formal education is English. So I'm writing it, perhaps I'm not writing it, the base I'm using is going to be English, but I'm writing it how I hear it. So that when you listen to it, if you're from here, you hear it too. If you're not from here, if you open your ear, you can hear it as well. It's about not centering yourself, the one who's always centered. And like you said in one of your interviews, being willing to be uncomfortable, being willing to be a bit disoriented. So I don't write for that ear. So when someone said that, it's clear that I'm writing, no, I'm writing the best I can of what I hear of us. So to your point, that is important to me, that it starts here. We are the center of our own story.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, of course, the huge similarity is that we are both from colonized cultures that have either chosen or have had to choose, you know, whatever, whether it's necessity or choice, we write in English. And that it's a reclaiming of English. We have both, you know, we're not the only ones doing it, of course, but we are among the people who have tried to reclaim and reshape English into something that belongs to us.
Yeah.
You know, with all of that history of colonization, all of the layers. And I don't know, of course, I'm not so familiar with the history of each country in the Caribbean, and I know very little about Antigua, but I know that in Malaysia, there are many different languages, right? And people write in either Malay or Chinese or Tamil or English. For me, English is really the only choice that made sense because, you know, so like you could say my ancestral language is Tamil, but I don't read or write it well, nowhere near well enough to ever be able to write in it in this lifetime. And Malay is the language, it's the medium of instruction in Malaysian schools. And I went to school in it, I was instructed in it, but it does not feel like the language of my heart. It does not feel like, you know, the language that I feel and think and dream in. So my language is very much Malaysian English. And I think this is what also I have in common with a lot of Caribbean writers. This is why I kind of consider them, you know, my cousins, my models, the older generation of Caribbean writers, because they are also writing in English. But it's not, you know, we're not trying to write in whatever the Queen's English, the King's English, it's our English. They've tried to make, that same process of like creating an English that can belong to us. I see that process in both our literary cultures.
I agree. We refer to it as Caribbean English, but even within Caribbean English, you have regional variations across the Caribbean and then within islands, within countries. So when we write in English, it's not about pandering to a particular gaze. It's the language that we were instructed in, but we are taking it and twisting it and making it our own, using our oral traditions and pouring into it and coming up with something new. Which is why one of the reviews I saw of your work is that your language is inventive. That made me smile because, I mean, it could be taken many ways, but how do you hear it?
Well, I mean, it's a word that gets used. I suppose I've seen, I mean, how do I hear it? Well,
because it says you're using untranslated Tamil words and using Bahasa syntax such as reduplicatives and intensifiers. It kind of feels to me like you could take it as a compliment, but not. It's kind of like I'm just writing how it sounds to me, how my people talk.
Yes, exactly. Yes, in that sense. Okay, because I didn't know when you quoted that one line, I didn't know which review it was from, so I didn't know the context. Now that you've read out the what's around it, I suppose my response to that is I didn't invent any of that. Like my people are inventive.
Exactly. But
yeah, I have a good, that's what I keep telling people, actually. I mean, I think I can be inventive as a writer, but that is not an example of it, because I think that is an example of me just having a good ear, like you talked about, you know, and you said, you know, an outsider can come and with an open ear be able to hear. But in our case, like when we are writing the language, the way that our people speak, it's also about having an open ear, but in a different way. Just like, you know, people ask me, like, how is it that you've lived outside Malaysia so long, but you still can talk like this and write like this? And I think it's just about an ear.
Yeah, and in terms of setting, the idea of not explaining yourself as well. Because when I say that the descriptiveness was familiar, I don't mean that you're explaining your culture to me or anybody else. It's reveling in the details that, for me, bring me pleasure about when I walk this land and the things that I see and the colors and everything. I enjoy trying to paint a picture with it. That's part of what brings me joy as a writer. And the audience is almost incidental to that. Can you speak to that in terms of yourself?
Yeah, I can definitely relate to what you're saying. It's just kind of taking a kind of pleasure in the things that you have always noticed, that as a young person, you know, that you found, that things that I found funny or things that I found striking as I was growing up, and even now when I go back, and those are in actually well before I ever thought, you know, I need to put this in a novel someday or anything. They're just those little things that you take pleasure in, or sometimes even you know, a kind of it's not always just pleasure. It's those things also that drove you nuts, like some of the things that have made you angry all your life, and they find a way into your writing. But I
But
don't
there's a
think
pleasure in that too. There's a pleasure in being
yes,
able to,
yes,
yes,
yeah,
the anger, the rage, because the politics in both of in both the writing, maybe of all colonized people, but of your writing and that I see in Caribbean writing as well. My writing is that all of it is not pleasant, but the sitting in it is also part of the quote unquote pleasure.
yeah, because there has to be something to do with that anger, that lifelong anger, and what do you do with it? And often, being writers, that's where it finds its place in our fiction. We put it there because there's only so many arguments that you can have with people. It often feels like a much more I don't want to use the word productive, but it feels on some level, it feels like a more useful place for it to go, for that anger to go, because at least you've made something beautiful with it rather than, just stewing or fighting with someone. But, go back to your point of, explaining your culture to other people. I think that when I read a writer who is from what the West would think of as a peripheral country, for somewhere far outside the West, I think that I'm very sensitive to that. And I can't say that I'm always 100% right about the author's intention, because I don't really know what they were thinking. And I don't really know if they were consciously thinking, oh, I need to explain this to my Western readers so that I can sell more books. In fact, I think it's very rarely the case. So I think that, I wouldn't say, more and more, the older I grow, I don't think that, I don't have this kind of judgy feeling of looking at someone else thinking, oh, they're doing this purely, cynical, they're just doing this because they want to sell more books, because I don't think that's how it works. But I think there's a kind of ingrained, if you don't catch it, if you don't catch yourself, it's almost effort to rein it in and say, oh, actually, I don't have to do this. I can just...
I agree.
And when I read something that is doing that, almost without the author having realized that they're doing it, I think I'm very sensitive to that. So when I read something, I can very immediately, often there have been times that I felt a particular book, or even just like one little passage in a book, was doing that, was suddenly stepping outside the narrative to explain. And sometimes it can just be a few words that sort of shifts the perspective, and then they're back in the narrative. And I think I often pick up on that when other people don't. And so because I was always so conscious of it as a reader, I think that I've tried, I have tried consciously to not do that, to explain as little as possible, to withhold in a way that I think sometimes can almost seem perverse, to certain types of readers. It seems like I'm doing this in a vengeful spirit, or just to be perverse, but it's not vengeful. It might have been when I was 20, then I was thinking, oh well, we had to figure out all your books, we had to read Enid Blyton and Jane Austen and Dickens, and we had to figure it out, and so now tit for tat. But that was like 20 years ago, and I think I've moved so far past that. It's not about revenge anymore. It's just about what I want to, it's actually just about the world that I want to create and the voice that I want to, and anything that breaks that voice, I think it comes down to that, like anything that breaks that voice.
I hate a glossary. I don't know about you. I hate
my second book has a glossary, in fact. So
are we ever the ones to suggest it? It's always
I did not suggest it. So we went through this, because that book took like 5 years to sell, and at the very beginning of the process, it had nothing, right? It had no glossary, it had nothing, and it just had the text. And then at one point in the editing, before it was actually sold to a publisher, I think it was with my former agent, that we went through this, oh, well, what if we try the footnotes thing like Juno Diaz did and see how that works? Because he did have a very clever way of like having the footnotes be almost like you had these two parallel.
I didn't feel the footnotes were about explaining anything. The footnotes were almost a part of the story. It's like you have to read them to understand the narrative. Yeah. It's the author's intention as opposed to the gaze of whoever.
Right. So I tried that as well. And then for some reason, we didn't feel that it worked so well for my book, for the particular book that I was writing. So I took out the footnotes, and most of what was in the footnotes found its way back into the text itself, like the novel itself. And then, after 5 years, and I changed agents, and the novel finally sold, and the whole thing with the glossary finally happened as a compromise, because there isn't very much, there hasn't been all that much fiction in English coming out of Malaysia. There's very little, people have very little of an understanding of the political background of, you know, what is actually what, when he refers to certain historical events, you know, what is it? What does it mean in the context of this? So that the compromise was to keep the glossary in, but put it at the end of the book so that you can read the whole book and pretend it's not there, and you don't even have to look at it if you don't want to.
When I started off writing children's books, I was not a children's book writer. Now I have 4 of them, one coming out this year, To Be a Cheetah. And what I've leaned into with that, the reason why I bring that up, because you write a lot about your kids. I don't think you do it as much now.
Yeah.
But I don't think I would have been a children's book writer without my nieces and nephews, because it's always something they did that, you know, this one, my nephew, To Be a Cheetah, he said, one day we're in the car, and he says, I wish I could be, I can't remember the exact phrase, but I wish I could be a cheetah so I could go to Africa and I don't know, run or something. And then what else? I wish I could be a hawk. So we're doing that. And then from that, I found a story.
Yeah.
And what I like about it is because we don't have as many stories. I mean, we have the oral tradition, obviously. We have Anansi, we have the Jumbi stories and so on. But we don't have as many stories written down for the little ones, which is when the imagination, which is when the fairy tales start to tell you these are what stories are, and these are who matter. Yeah. You know, and this is who gets saved. And so when I wrote a Caribbean fairy tale, for instance, with Grace, that centered a little Black girl with hair like me, with skin like me, that was important to me. So I guess my question to you is, do you have a children's book in you? Because I feel like you've already written like 3, 4 of them. And I know you're a big literary fiction best-selling author, but you're also a mother who enjoys telling her stories inspired by her children. And you've had some very particular experiences as a Malaysian writer in France that I think is a little niche that it has not been. So I guess that's me kind of nudging you. What are you doing with that?
I don't know. I always told myself, I mean, I told myself that when this second novel finally sold and was out in the world, that I would explore some other projects. Like, I had this idea that I want to write a play or a children's book. It's still kind of there, kind of in the back burner, because I don't quite know. I just have to, you know, it takes a certain kind of courage to go in this direction that I've never gone in before. But I think, if someday, it's something I've been thinking about for a long, long time. And then, you know, part of what holds me back is also like, wow, there's so many people who are doing this kind of thing so much better. And I would be a beginner. I would be a total beginner in both of these things, like either writing for the stage or writing a children's book. But
I think it helped me that I didn't think of it, because I don't think about genre when I'm writing. I think about just telling the story. So if I thought I'm going to be a children's book writer, I probably wouldn't have done it, right? It was just a story, and for me, the story kind of tells me what the form is. So someone would say to me, "Oh, I think this is a novel," but the story is saying to me, "No, I'm a short story. I'm done. I'm done telling you this. This is all I have to tell you." And I have to listen to that. But I brought up the children's book because we both grew up in cultures where we didn't see a lot of stories about us, from us. I wonder, in some ways, I feel like that's something I've come to embrace. And I wonder if you think about that at all in terms of the stories that little girls like you are still not being told.
Yeah. I mean, I do think about it. Yes. Yeah, you make a good point. It's something to, because especially there are like, Malaysian writers who are writing the stories that we didn't get told. But actually, like from my community, from the Malaysian Tamil community, there is not a lot for kids who, and there's so many who are like me, who are from kind of English-speaking families, and yet, a minority in Malaysia, and kind of looking for those stories, about people like them. There isn't a lot. You're right.
I think that's something that I didn't understand. That I said to people, I get a lot of my history through fiction. I think I get a lot of my understanding of other cultures through fiction as well. That idea that, because I think from the outside looking in, you're Malaysian, but you talk a lot about being a minority in your own culture, which is, I mean, as a Black person in the world, as a woman in the world, I can relate to a certain point, but there's certain things. I'm still, in Antigua and Barbuda, I'm still the dominant culture. I mean, know, so just these different, I don't know, I just find all of that very interesting.
That's something that, well, I know that, Chimamanda Adichie famously, she wrote about how she kind of had to go to the US to realize that she was Black because, or to really think about it, because in Nigeria, she was just one, she was once again the part of the dominant, she did not have issues around being Black. It was just everyone was Black. And, there were other divisions, religion and race. Religion and class and all that, but not race, right? She had to discover race in the US, which is, that is something very different. And I think a lot of people don't think about, they see like Black or brown people. And in the context of the West, we're all minorities. And so they kind of see us all as minorities, which is not at all the case. So like I have never been part of the dominant or majority culture in any place that I've lived, not since birth up to now, never have I been part of the majority. So I think that is something that has informed my thinking and my writing, and kind of just generally the way I move through the world. I have not been part of the majority, and I don't really know what that is like. I can kind of imagine it, but I don't know it. Yeah, if I had grown up in India, in Tamil Nadu, then I would have been the majority, but that's not been the case. Yeah.
What's interesting to me, we'll end on this point, is in a way they're shifting identities even within that. Speaking, just centering myself for a minute, because when I wrote my book Musical Youth, I was thinking a lot about growing up in Antigua. Yes, majority Black, but within that, coming out from a history of slavery and colonialism, so many ways that people find to separate themselves. So you have different classes and an intersection of class and race that's harder to see.
Yes.
So that, for instance, subtle ways that texturism, your hair, your features, your shades of your skin affect where you fit into the society. So that even though you're majority Black in a majority Black society, you're still from Galvamatas, Antigua, working class, Antigua, you're still not of the... So there's still so many little shades of it that I'm still exploring. That this idea of our identities as being like a color block thing, this sharp line, to me is kind of funny because it's not. I've never had the luxury of it being that. So that's just my 2 cents on that. Do you have anything that you want to say to the Caribbean and Antiguan people before we wrap up, Preeta?
Oh my goodness, that's such a tall order. A message for the Caribbean people in general. I mean, actually, what I want to say is that I'm so grateful to Caribbean culture for having been there when I was growing up, and for me to kind of see before I, because really, I think Caribbean literature was the first kind of non-white, non-Western literature that I encountered, even before I encountered South Asian literature. So, be so thankful to have had it there as both, how they talk about mirrors and windows in children's literature, but it was kind of both for me. In some ways it really was a mirror, even though I'm not at all still have not been to the Caribbean. And in other ways it was this fascinating window. And I'm just really grateful to the Caribbean for existing, actually. And my other thing that I would want to say is that I would so love someday to visit the Caribbean, anywhere.
Well, I'm here, so you know where to find me. But I just find it, as you were saying, that I find it really, I mean, I wouldn't take nothing from my journey now, but we should not have to work to find reflections of ourselves. But that's what colonialism did to us, I'm grateful. Speaking of gratitude, I'm going to get mushy for a minute and say I'm grateful that we met when we did. I am very asocial, and so the idea of rooming with someone and being in a different space was not comfortable for me. But we connected, and I'm glad that we're still connected. I admire you as a writer, and I love you as a person. I love how bold, because you don't get an easy time. You don't make it. You don't shy away from saying what you need to say because people might get angry or get uncomfortable. And that is inspirational as well.
Oh, thank you. It is easier on social media though than in person. I mean, I think probably that's where the cultural differences. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to generalize about Caribbean culture that I don't know well, but I know that for me, coming from South Asian, from Tamil culture, I was not socialized to be outspoken, to rock the boat, to tell the truth. None of that. That is where social media has really helped me to be outspoken in a way that I'm not that outspoken in real life. Although I think that gradually, with the help of social media, I've become a little bit more outspoken in real life, thanks to that. that it was like training wheels. Social media was like training wheels on my bike of confidence, you know. So now I'm
I love that. Love that.
I'm
No,
a little
but
bit more confident now, but yeah.
I said thank God. I mean, you said social media for me was the page. Just the idea that the page was freedom for me. Like I would say
Yes,
anything on the
that too.
page.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Thank you so
especially
much.
fiction. Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Preeta. So
Thank
you
you
will
for
have to
having
come.
me.
You will have to come to Antigua at some point. I will have to come to Paris at some point and
I would love
Malaysia
that.
because it's always a journey to learning more about other people and other cultures. And I think that's the blessing of being the culture that's diminished or that's seen as not being mainstream, is that we're always open to the adventure of finding out other things.
Yes, that is true. That is true. Yeah, that is the blessing. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
We have to look for the blessing, Peter. We have to look for the blessings. Thank you so much.